You stand in a candlelit room in early 14th century France. Candlelight trembles on stone. The air smells of tallow and parchment. A key clinks softly along a corridor while a warm seal settles into wax. Beyond the walls, riders move under moonlight, carrying orders that will ripple from Paris to the Atlantic harbors, where Templar ships once rocked in their berths. Before dawn, an order famed for courage will be led in chains, not to battle, but to questions. If quiet histories like this help you drift, settle in and let the bells keep watch. A gentle like or subscribe keeps these candles lit for more nights like this. And in that hush, a quiet pontiff from Gascony lifts a cool iron key and turns toward his path. Bertrand de Got's journey to the papacy began far from the marble staircases of Rome. Bertrand de Got's journey to the papacy began far from the marble staircases of Rome. Born in the wine country of Villandraut in the Duchy of Gascony, he was shaped more by the scent of damp oak barrels and the measured patience of the vineyard than by the thrum of imperial politics. Yet by 1305 he had risen to become Archbishop of Bordeaux, a position balanced uneasily between the English crown's claims and French influence. Gascony itself was a hinge in Europe's power structure, and Bertrand knew the art of standing still while the world turned hard around him. When the papal conclave convened that summer, the College of Cardinals was deeply divided. The papal throne had been empty for nearly a year after the death of Benedict XI. The air was thick with the residue of Boniface VIII's conflict with Philip IV of France, a quarrel that had left bruises on both church and crown. Bertrand was not the obvious choice for pope. He was neither a fiery reformer nor a willing pawn. He was, however, a man both sides thought they could manage, and that, in the politics of conclaves, is often the surest path to the fisherman's ring. The election itself, according to surviving records, took place in the Italian town of Perugia. The decision was made with more whispered conditions than public proclamations. Chroniclers suggest Philip IV had privately met with Bertrand before the conclave and extracted certain assurances. Whether promises or mere understandings is still debated. When the votes settled, Bertrand de Got emerged as Clement V, a pope-elect who had never been a cardinal and who, in time, would never set foot in the Eternal City. Historical record tells us that Bertrand de Got was elected pope in 1305 as Clement V, marking one of the rare instances where the chosen pontiff had not been a cardinal. One curious note is that he brought with him to court a taste for Gascon wine, and casks of it would follow his retinue for years, a moving cellar on the roads of Europe. Some still question whether Clement owed his tiara to a binding deal with Philip IV, or were the conditions of his election more rumor than record. On the day of his enthronement, the symbols of papal authority were heavy in more ways than one. The triple crown, the tiara, sat upon his head as if carved from the obligations of kingdoms. The keys of St. Peter, crossed and gilded, were embroidered into the canopy above him. Yet there was no mistaking the iron key in his own hand that day, the one that opened the door to his private chambers. A pope's key is not only to unlock a door, but to secure a trust. In Clement's grasp, it seemed also a reminder of who might yet hold the greater set of keys beyond Rome's walls. The mood in France was watchful. Philip IV had not forgotten his debts to the Knights Templar, nor the independence the order maintained through their wealth and networks. For now, Clement's attention was taken with the ceremonial swirl of his new role. Vestments heavy with gold thread, processions lit by walls of candles. the air thick with the resinous smoke of burning incense. The wax dripped in slow beads, pooling on the bases of the candlesticks like hours melting into days. Outside, autumn mists clung to the city's stone facades, blurring banners and softening the sound of hooves on the cobbles. Though the conclave had ended, the negotiations that began it had not. Letters moved quietly between Paris and the papal court, each sealed with wax, impressed by seals that told as much about power as the words inside. Clement, still adjusting to the shift from Bordeaux's familiar rhythms to the demands of the universal church, understood that every decision in his early months would be weighed in both scripture and silver. His Gascon pragmatism served him well. He preferred to watch the ripples before moving the boat. The first weeks of his papacy passed without dramatic rupture. There were no open declarations against the French king, nor any rash reforms that might alarm the cardinals who had gambled on his caution. Yet beneath the surface, currents began to stir. Reports of unrest in Italy, whispers of Templar fortunes sitting like unharvested grain in their commanderies, and the ongoing tension over the papacy's independence all pressed at the edges of Clement's days. The candle on his desk seemed always to burn at a slant, as if some unseen draft came from the direction of Paris. In the evenings, Clement is said to have walked the galleries of his residence, key in hand, feeling the cool bite of its metal against his palm. To an observer, it might seem a trivial habit, but for Clement, it was a tether to his own sense of agency. Keys could open as well as lock. They could keep secrets safe, or grant entry to demands one could not refuse. He had been given the keys of the church in the eyes of the world, but the question of whose hand might guide his own lingered like a shadow along the candlelit walls. The city of Lyons, with its mingled Roman bones and Gothic skin, wrapped around the papal household like a half-trusting host. Merchants still haggled in its markets, monks still prayed in its chapels, and the Seine and Rhone rivers still threaded their silver-gray way toward the sea. Yet in the higher rooms of the city, where Clement worked by candle and quill, the air was taut with unspoken arrangements. Soon, events would turn sharply, and the cold iron key would be matched by a colder truth about the reach of royal will. And so the candle burned low, the wax pooling wider, and the sound of the bells faded into the hush of evening. In that quiet, Clement V began to sense that his reign would be less a voyage across calm waters than a careful crossing on a rope, drawn tight between crown and altar. The rope would quiver sooner than he thought, on a coronation day when the very walls seemed to betray their weight. The morning of Clement V's coronation in Lyons began with the measured pomp of medieval ceremony. The city had dressed itself for the occasion, its steep streets strung with banners, its squares crowded with merchants, nobles, clergy, and curious townsfolk. Along the route to the cathedral, the air was threaded with the fragrance of pine boughs laid over muddy cobbles to keep the procession's path clean, mingled with the sharper scents of tallow and horse sweat. Bells pealed in long, deliberate waves from the towers, calling the city to witness a moment that was meant to affirm both heaven's blessing and earthly order. Clement rode beneath a canopy held by attendants, robed in white and gold, his face pale but composed. Above him, from a timber gallery hastily erected for honored guests, nobles leaned forward for a better view. Among them were John II, Duke of Brittany, and other luminaries of the French court. The structure creaked softly under their shifting weight, the sound lost in the music of trumpets and choir. Inside the cathedral, candles bloomed in their hundreds. their light catching on the gilt of icons and the jeweled clasps of gospel books. The smoke of burning incense pooled in the high vaults, softening the daylight that spilled through colored glass. The liturgy moved at the stately pace of the church's centuries, each prayer and chant echoing in the stone like a heartbeat made audible. Clement's hands, one still faintly calloused from years as a working archbishop, held the crozier and then the papal keys, emblems as symbolic as they were ceremonial. Yet outside, amid the press of onlookers and the sway of the gallery, something shifted. Accounts differ on the exact cause. Some say a horse below was startled by the blare of trumpets, jolting the crowd and shaking the supports. Others blame the weight of too many bodies leaning over the rail for a glimpse of the new pontiff. Whatever the trigger, the timber structure gave way with a groan and a sudden splintering crack. In a moment that would sear itself into the memory of the day, the gallery collapsed onto the street below. The sound was like a tree splitting in a storm, brief, brutal, final. Dust and splinters burst into the air, mingled with shouts and the clang of armor as guards rushed to help. Several were killed instantly, including the Duke of Brittany. Others lay pinned under beams, their finery torn and dulled by blood and dust. Clement himself was struck by falling masonry or debris. Sources differ, and though not gravely injured, he bore the ache for days afterward. The coronation paused in a confusion of prayer and aid, the solemnity of the rite fractured by the raw intrusion of mortality. Historical record tells us that at Clement V's 1305 coronation in Lyon, a temporary viewing structure collapsed, killing and injuring several, including John II, Duke of Brittany. One curious note is that some witnesses swore they saw a puff of candle smoke swirl unnaturally just before the collapse, as if even the wax had drawn in its breath. Some still question whether this was merely an accident of poor carpentry and crowding, or did contemporaries take it as a sign, a divine commentary on the pontificate's path? In medieval Europe, public disasters were rarely viewed as random misfortune. The collapse became for many a whispered omen. For some, it foreshadowed the papacy's coming trials. For others, it was a reminder that no ceremony, however holy, could escape the fragility of earthly things. Chroniclers recorded the event with varying degrees of moral weight. A few French accounts downplayed it as a tragic accident, eager not to mar the legitimacy of a pope friendly to the crown. Others in more distant lands cast it as a warning to both pope and king that heaven's patience was not inexhaustible. For Clement, the moment may have struck more privately. He had come to Lyon to be crowned in full sight of Christendom's power brokers, yet here was an early lesson that grandeur was always a step from ruin. The imagery would stay with him. Timber beams splitting, fine robes in the dust, the sudden silence after the collapse broken only by moans and the hiss of settling debris. In later years, when he weighed the fate of the Knights Templar and balanced it against the will of Philip IV, the memory of that day, when wood, stone, and flesh all proved vulnerable, may have deepened his instinct for caution. In the days after, the city repaired its streets, and the papal entourage prepared to move on. The dead were buried with honor. The injured tended as best medieval medicine allowed. Lyon returned to its rhythms, but for those who had stood in the square, the scent of pine boughs would forever carry a trace of dust and grief. The Pope continued his reign with measured steps, yet in private moments he was seen turning a key in his hand, perhaps reminded that the locks of power could as easily admit misfortune as exclude it. The coronation had been meant to display the stability of church and crown, the unity of the Christian West under a new shepherd. Instead, it left behind the image of a papacy already shadowed by the unpredictable. And in that shadow, the quiet pull of the French court would grow stronger, threading itself through the Pope's decisions like an unseen cord. That cord would soon tighten, as the needs of a crown weighed heavier than the incense of any cathedral. In the years before Clement V's election, France's king Philip IV, called Le Bel, the Fair, had cultivated a reputation for icy composure and relentless policy. His beauty, chroniclers said, was matched by a reserve that left allies and enemies guessing at his true thoughts. Beneath the smooth exterior ran a current of financial strain. The wars with England, the expensive administration of his realm, and the ambitious embellishments of his court had drained the royal treasury. Like many monarchs, Philip had turned to the church and its networks not only for moral authority, but for ready credit. Among his creditors stood the Knights Templar. Over decades, the order had grown from a brotherhood of warrior monks into a vast institution whose preceptories dotted Europe. Their coffers were not merely filled with crusader spoils. They functioned as bankers to princes, safeguarding deposits, transferring funds, and issuing letters of credit that could be cashed across borders. For a king in need, their system was both a blessing and a source of quiet resentment. To borrow was to be reminded of another's power. By the opening of Clement's pontificate, Philip's debts to the Templars were substantial. The records, when they can be pieced together, show loans for military campaigns and the maintenance of fortresses. These were not gifts. The order expected repayment, and though they were loyal to Christendom, they answered to no single crown. In the political imagination of the time, wealth unbound to the monarchy was a danger as well as a temptation. Historical record tells us that Philip IV owed significant debts to the Knights Templar and was engaged in consolidating royal authority over the French realm. One curious note is that royal clerks sometimes stored loan contracts in carved chests that required 3 keys, one for the crown, one for the lender, and one for a neutral custodian. Some still question whether Philip's pursuit of the Templars was driven primarily by the need to erase these debts, or were charges of heresy a genuine, if mistaken, concern. Clement, newly crowned and still settling into the papal rhythm, could not fail to notice the signals from Paris. Letters arrived couched in courteous terms, yet carrying the weight of expectation. Philip's legal mind, sharpened by his counselors like Guillaume de Nogaret, sought to redefine the boundaries between royal and papal spheres. The memory of Boniface VIII's defiance and the scandal of Anagni still hung in the air. The French king had humiliated a pope before. It was not unthinkable he might attempt it again if his interests were thwarted. The crown's influence was felt not only in words, but in the movements of people. French envoys lingered at the papal court, their presence a reminder that every papal bull would be read in Paris with an eye to advantage. Even in the markets and taverns of cities where Clement resided, there were murmurs about the closeness of the new pope to the French court. These were murmurs the pope could not openly rebuke without widening the very rift he wished to avoid. Clement's own instincts leaned toward mediation, toward preserving the appearance of unity in Christendom. His Gascon upbringing had taught him the value of measured speech and the peril of sudden moves in a contested landscape. Yet the more he listened, the clearer it became that Philip's patience was finite. In private, Clement is said to have kept correspondence from the French king in a chest at his bedside, tied with a narrow cord of red silk, a cord that, when pulled, loosed more obligations than it bound. The balance was delicate. The Pope needed the cooperation of France to address matters far beyond the Templars, disputes in Italy, negotiations with England, the perennial question of a new crusade. But Philip's court had its own list of priorities, and high among them was the curbing of the Templars' independence. To the king, this was not merely about money. It was about sovereignty, about ensuring that no armed and wealthy order within his borders could operate without his leave. As winter edged into spring, Clement began to see the shape of the game. It was not a single confrontation, but a slow tightening. Offers couched as requests, requests wrapped as favors. One could call it diplomacy. One could also call it the steady turning of a key in a lock you had not noticed was closed. The image of keys would return often in Clement's thoughts. The gilded keys of St. Peter on the papal banner, the iron keys of fortress gates, the wax-impressed key images on sealed letters. Each carried the same implication: access controlled, passage permitted or denied at another's will. In the candlelit stillness of his chambers, Clement would sometimes weigh the physical key to his writing desk in his palm before unlocking it. Inside lay petitions from bishops, reports from distant dioceses, and increasingly, dossiers prepared by Philip's agents on the Templars. These described not only the order's wealth, but alleged breaches of faith, secret rituals, blasphemous acts, and hidden idols. Whether Clement believed them in whole or part is uncertain, but he knew their potential as political levers. To reject the king's pressure outright would risk repeating the ruinous papal-French conflicts of the past decade. To acquiesce entirely would compromise the independence of the papacy. For the moment, Clement chose neither extreme. He listened. He read. He allowed the dossiers to rest in the desk, as if waiting for the wax on the matter to soften enough to be reshaped. Outside his chamber, the life of the city went on. Merchants cried their wares. Stonemasons chipped at cathedral repairs. The scent of baking bread mingled with the tang of river water. Yet in the papal household, the air felt different, charged, expectant, as though those who moved within it sensed that the Pope's measured steps were leading toward an unavoidable crossroad. Clement understood that a day would come when the crown's heavy hand would press more openly on the papal shoulder. When it did, the balance of keys, chains, and candles would shift, and the door it opened might not be closed again. That pressure would find its focus soon enough, in the glint of coin and the quiet clink of treasure chests that were never far from a king's thoughts. In the first decade of the 14th century, the Order of the Knights Templar occupied a position that no other institution in Christendom could quite match. Founded in the wake of the First Crusade to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, they had grown into a transnational network of fortresses, farms, ports, and treasuries. Their banner, the red cross on a white field, still carried the echo of battle cries from Acre and Antioch. But in Europe, it had come to signify something quieter and in some ways more potent: financial reach. The Templars managed estates in nearly every kingdom, collecting rents, raising crops, and breeding horses. They operated mills, pressed wine, and oversaw herds of sheep whose wool found its way to distant markets. But it was their role as bankers that drew the most attention. Pilgrims could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in Paris and withdraw the equivalent in Acre or Cyprus, traveling without the danger of carrying coin. Kings entrusted them with war chests, noblewomen with dowries, merchants with profits from far-off ventures. The order's ledgers, kept in a neat clerical hand, were as much a tool of their power as the sword and lance. Historical record tells us that the Knights Templar owned extensive properties and ran a sophisticated financial network across Europe and the Mediterranean. One curious note is that some preceptories issued letters of credit on thin sheets of parchment folded into palm-sized packets, sealed with a dab of tinted wax that matched the issuing house's colors. Some still question whether the Templars truly guarded a vast, concentrated treasure in France, or is the idea of a single hoard a later Romantic invention. For Philip IV, the sight of such resources under another authority's control was unsettling. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, not to any crown, and their independence was jealously guarded. In France alone, they held dozens of commanderies, including a fortified headquarters in Paris, just northwest of the Seine. There, behind thick walls, stood their treasury, a complex of secure chambers whose locks required multiple keys and whose guards were sworn brothers of the order. The king himself had at times stored his valuables there, trusting the Templars' vaults more than his own. Clement V, as Pope, knew the order's value to Christendom. In theory, their wealth and discipline could serve a renewed crusade. In practice, the loss of the Holy Land in 1291 had left them without a clear military role. Their presence in Cyprus and along the Mediterranean coast was a shadow of the days when they had garrisoned Jerusalem. In Europe, and some in Europe, their martial training found little outlet beyond guarding roads and lending expertise to sieges. The question lingered: what was to be done with an army whose battlefield had vanished and whose coffers overflowed? Rumors began to cling to the order like burrs on a cloak. Some said the Templars had grown soft, more concerned with rents and loans than with the defense of the faith. Others whispered of secret rites at initiations, strange symbols, and oaths taken in dimly lit halls. Most of these stories were the stuff of tavern talk and envious rivals, but in the hands of a king seeking cause, they could be sharpened into accusations. Clement's position was delicate. He had no wish to see the Templars destroyed, but neither could he ignore the political gravity drawing him toward the French court's agenda. To shield the order outright might provoke Philip. To condemn them without due process would undercut the Church's claim to justice. The Pope's own archives recorded the order's service and sacrifice, yet he also received letters, pointed in tone, heavy with implication, about their supposed moral failings. Within the Templar ranks, there was awareness of the shifting winds. Some leaders urged reform, perhaps even a merger with the Hospitallers, to present a united military order for the next crusade. Others dismissed the threat, trusting in their papal privileges and the righteousness of their mission. In their halls, the candlelight still fell on shields and spurs, on coffers banded with iron, on the carved crosses over every door. But outside those walls, the gaze of the French crown grew keener. In Paris, the temple's treasury stood not far from the markets where gossip moved faster than goods. Merchants, envoys, and even royal clerks carried tales of the order's supposed arrogance, their secretive councils, the thickness of their walls. These murmurs did not escape the notice of the king's advisers, who understood that public suspicion could soften resistance to royal action. Clement, reading reports by candlelight, would pause over figures that seemed both impressive and dangerous. Annual incomes tallied in thousands of livres, inventories of horses and arms, lists of properties that spanned the map. The wax seals on these reports were often still warm from the hands of their messengers, the imprint of the key motif pressed into them, catching the light like a silent promise. The Pope was no stranger to the allure and peril of wealth. He knew that in the ledger lines of the Templars lay both the means to defend the faith and the temptation to control it. In the weeks to come, these accounts and accusations would merge into a single thread, one that, once pulled, would unravel the fabric of the order's standing in France. And that thread would be grasped firmly on a misty October morning, when riders carried sealed orders and the sound of keys would mean only locks turning from the outside. Before dawn on October 13, 1307, Paris was wrapped in a cool, colorless mist. The lamps along its narrow lanes guttered in the breeze, their flames bending low, casting long, unsteady shadows on wet cobblestones. Somewhere beyond the city walls, the first hoofbeats echoed, a steady, deliberate rhythm muffled by the damp earth. They were not the hurried gallop of a messenger, but the measured pace of a company on an errand too important to rush. Across France, similar sounds marked the morning. Riders carried packets sealed with the royal fleur-de-lis, each packet bearing strict instructions. It was not to be opened until the appointed day and hour. Inside was the king's command to arrest every member of the Order of the Knights Templar within reach. The coordination was unprecedented. Sheriffs, bailies, and royal sergeants across the realm would break their seals together, then move swiftly before word could spread. Historical record tells us that on Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip IV's officers began a mass arrest of Templars throughout France under secret, simultaneous orders. One curious note is that the sealed orders were sometimes secured with cords dyed in the royal colors, knotted so that any tampering left a frayed mark even if the wax remained intact. Some still question whether this is the true origin of Friday the 13th's unlucky reputation, or did the superstition develop separately centuries later? In Paris, the temple complex lay quiet under the fog. Its towers and walls, usually a bustle of servants and visiting merchants, showed only the dim outlines of guards at their posts. The brothers within had no reason to suspect what approached. They had gone to bed the night before under the same routines they had followed for decades. Matins had been prayed, the treasury sealed for the night, the gates barred against casual intrusion. When the royal officers arrived, they came not as marauders, but as enforcers of law, at least in the king's eyes. They bore writs, not swords drawn, though armed men flanked them. The gatekeepers were ordered to stand aside. The surprise was such that little resistance was offered. Templar brothers, roused from sleep or interrupted at prayer, were confronted with lists of charges so grave they seemed almost absurd: renouncing Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, engaging in indecent rituals. Elsewhere in France, from the fortified houses of Normandy to the preceptories in Languedoc, the same pattern unfolded. Dawn light revealed armed men at the gates, officials with sealed parchments, and Templar commanders caught between disbelief and the need to protect their brethren. Horses stamped in the yards, breath pluming in the cold, as brothers were bound and led away. Clement V, hundreds of miles distant, was not the architect of this moment. Whether he knew in advance of the precise timing remains debated, but the arrest's scale and secrecy bore the unmistakable mark of Philip's will. For the king, the simultaneous strike ensured that wealth, records, and persons of interest could not be hidden or spirited away. It was a tactic borrowed from military sieges, cut off all points of escape at once, and applied to an order that had once commanded armies. News of the arrests spread quickly in the cities. In marketplaces, the shock was mingled with curiosity. Some wondered what could provoke the crown to act against men who had fought for Christendom. Others whispered that the accusations must be true for the king to move so decisively. Still others suspected that truth was not the point, that coin, land, and political advantage were the real prizes. Within the temple in Paris, the once busy corridors grew hushed, as brothers were confined to chambers or marched out under guard. The treasury's great locks, which had for years clicked open to admit king's deposits, now clanged shut under the crown's keys. Wax seals bearing the royal arms were pressed over hasps and door frames, the warm wax cooling into hard, brittle authority. It is easy, centuries later, to picture the morning as a single, cinematic moment: the fog, the knock at the gate, the reading of charges. In truth, it was many mornings, many knocks, many readings, an orchestration of control that reached from Paris to the far corners of the kingdom. The efficiency with which it was done left little doubt about the crown's administrative reach. For the Templars, the date would become a hinge in their history. Before it, they were a respected, if sometimes envied, institution, guardians of treasures both spiritual and material. After it, they were prisoners awaiting the slow grind of inquiry. For those who lived through it, the day was not a superstition, but a sudden inversion of fortune, Friday the 13th, not as curse, but as a coordinated decision in ink, wax, and steel. By evening, the mists had lifted in most of France, revealing the familiar outlines of towns and fields under a pale sky. But for the brothers taken from their commanderies, the world had already shifted into a different light, one filtered through the bars of a cell or the guarded doorway of a hall, turned into a prison. And in those guarded halls, more packets of parchment waited to be opened, letters whose words would close doors far beyond the temple's own gates. The royal orders that launched the arrests on October 13th did not end with the first clatter of hooves or the rattle of chains. They were part of a larger paper net, spun in advance and cast wide across the realm. Each packet of instructions, delivered to baileys, seneschals, and local sheriffs, was one thread of that net, and together they pulled the Templars into confinement before they could sense the shape of the snare. The circular letters were deceptively ordinary in appearance. A sheet of parchment folded once, the edges tucked and sealed with a disc of golden wax stamped with the royal seal. The cords binding them were dyed in the deep blue and red of France, and knotted so that no hand could untie them without leaving the telltale fray of tampering. Recipients had been told to hold these unopened until the morning of the 13th, a measure that kept even the king's own officers in ignorance until the last possible moment. Historical record tells us that royal officials across France received sealed orders in advance to be opened simultaneously on October 13, 1307, instructing the arrest of all Templars and the seizure of their property. One curious note is that in some towns, the unopened orders were kept overnight in the parish church's locked chest beneath the relics, as if proximity to the sacred would safeguard their secrecy. Some still question whether how long Philip IV's council had been drafting and distributing these orders, and whether the Pope was fully briefed before they were dispatched, remains uncertain. When the seals were finally broken, the contents left no room for discretion. Names of local Templars were listed alongside instructions to secure their persons, their arms, their horses, and their documents. All chests, storerooms, and treasuries were to be locked and sealed under royal authority. In some cases, officers were instructed to post guards immediately at every entrance, allowing no one in or out until the king's representatives could conduct an inventory. The effect in towns and villages was swift and strange. A preceptory that had been a fixture of the community, its brothers tending to travelers, lending coin, overseeing mills, was suddenly sealed like a crime scene. Locals watched as officials pressed warm wax over doors and gates, the imprints hardening into symbols of power. The brothers within were confined to their quarters or led away to makeshift holding cells in castles, abbeys, or town halls. In Paris, the temple's great gate was closed not by the hands of its own guards, but by men carrying the king's writ. Keys once turned by Templar commanders now hung from the belts of royal sergeants. Doors that had opened for merchants, messengers, and pilgrims for decades were barred, their locks claimed in the king's name. Inventories began almost at once, clerks unrolling long sheets of parchment to note everything from golden chalices to the number of hens in the yard. The same pattern played out from the marshes of Poitou to the wine country of Burgundy, from the Norman coast to the foothills of the Pyrenees. Where the Templars had estates, there came men with wax seals and the authority to close what had always been open. In some places, the arrests were met with murmured sympathy, in others, with a wary curiosity. Clement V, when word reached him of the scale and speed of the operation, faced a complicated choice. To object outright would pit him against a king who had moved under the banner of rooting out heresy. To endorse it without reservation would signal that papal justice could be preempted by royal will. For the moment, he issued no public condemnation, letting the machinery of inquiry begin, while reserving the right to direct its course. In the weeks after the arrests, the sealed doors became a kind of silent testimony. In towns where the Templars had been prominent, the sight of their gatehouses, shut, with the royal seal cracked and weathering, was a reminder that power could shift overnight. Those seals, so easily pressed into warm wax, seemed to the Pope and King alike a fitting emblem, malleable while hot, immutable once cooled. And behind those closed doors, in rooms now dusty and still, lay not only the Templars' goods and records, but the lingering scent of their daily life, wax and leather, oil and grain, waiting to be catalogued, judged, and perhaps claimed. Soon, the lists of what was taken would be joined by lists of what was alleged, and the quiet of sealed halls would give way to the sharper echo of accusations. When the Templars were seized, the king's officers did not arrive empty-handed. Alongside the orders of arrest were parchments that carried a litany of charges, set down in clear but ominous Latin. The lists were not brief. They read like inventories of sin, and to those who heard them, The breadth of the accusations was almost as startling as their suddenness. Foremost among them was the claim that new initiates to the order were required to renounce Christ, an act that, if true, would place the Templars beyond the pale of Christian society. This was followed by charges that the brothers spat upon the cross, trampled it underfoot, or otherwise dishonored the very symbol they were sworn to defend. There were allegations of secret oaths taken in darkened chambers, of indecent kisses exchanged at initiation, of unnatural acts committed in defiance of moral law. The most peculiar charges spoke of idol worship. One accusation claimed the Templars venerated a mysterious head, sometimes described as bearded, sometimes as a metal or wooden effigy. A few documents named it Baphomet, a word that puzzled contemporaries and still resists certain translation, possibly a corruption of Mahomet, used generically for Muslim prophets, or a local term garbled by rumor. Historical record tells us that the formal charges against the Templars included heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, and moral corruption, presented in detailed articles to justify the arrests. One curious note is that some lists of charges were read aloud in marketplaces to gather public support, the crier's voice, carrying over the smell of bread and fish stalls. Some still question whether these accusations had any basis in actual Templar practice, or were constructed wholesale by Philip IV's legal advisors, remains one of history's most disputed questions. For many who heard these charges for the first time, disbelief mingled with unease. The Templars had long been cloaked in secrecy, necessary, they argued, for the discipline of their order and the security of their missions. Yet secrecy can breed suspicion, and in the minds of the king's prosecutors, that suspicion could be cultivated into conviction. The structure of the accusations was deliberate. They moved from the shocking to the salacious, from doctrinal offenses that threatened souls to bodily sins that inflamed imaginations. By including both, the Crown's lawyers ensured that every hearer, whether pious theologian or gossip-hungry townsman, would find cause for outrage. It was a careful weaving of theological and popular appeal, meant to soften resistance to the coming trials. In Paris, the list was read to the detained brothers themselves. Many protested, some wept, others remained silent. They were told that confession could lead to mercy, that resistance could lead to worse. The line between spiritual counsel and legal threat blurred in those first interrogations, as inquisitors and royal officers worked side by side. Clement V, receiving the formal catalogue of accusations from Philip's envoys, understood both its gravity and its political utility. The Pope had jurisdiction over the order, and these charges, if substantiated, could compel him to act. But he also recognized the potential for manipulation. The same legal minds who had helped Philip defeat the memory of Boniface VIII were now arrayed against the Templars. Clement could not simply dismiss the allegations without undermining the Church's claim to guard orthodoxy, nor could he accept them without evidence, without surrendering papal independence. In the provinces, the charges began to shape perception. Merchants recalled moments when Templar brothers had refused to disclose the contents of sealed chests. Travelers remembered being turned away from a gate without explanation. Innocuous acts were reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. The Red Cross that had once inspired awe began to draw sideways glances. The catalogue of accusations, copied and dispatched to courts across France, was not just a legal instrument, it was a tool of narrative. It told the people what to think before the accused had a chance to speak. It shifted the burden from proof to defense, from king's claim to Templar's denial. In the quiet of his chambers, Clement is said to have read the list more than once, candlelight catching on the inked words heresis and idolatria. The wax seal that had closed the packet lay cooling beside him, its impression of a crown and fleur-de-lis hardening into permanence. Outside, the bells of evening tolled, their sound stretching into the hush like a question not yet answered. And in that hush, the Pope weighed his own next move, whether to stand against the crown or to step into the shadows gathering over Avignon. By the end of 1307, Clement V's papal court had not yet taken up full residence in Avignon, but the city's name was already beginning to thread itself into the story. Nestled on the east bank of the Rhône, Avignon was a place of confluence, of rivers, of trade, and increasingly of politics. The Pope still moved between various French and Gascon strongholds, but each step away from Rome's marble heart seemed to draw him closer to the gravitational pull of the French crown. The arrests of the Templars in October had cast a long shadow, one that reached even into the halls of papal administration. Clement received reports from bishops across France, each detailing the sudden seizures, the inventories, and the accusations that followed. The tone varied. Some prelates were eager to see the charges tested, others urged caution, and a few hinted at unease with the king's methods. Yet the common thread was unmistakable. The matter was too large to ignore, and it had arrived at the Pope's door whether he had summoned it or not. Historical record tells us that Clement V began moving the papal court toward Avignon in the years following his election, marking the start of what would later be called the Avignon Papacy. One curious note is that early sessions in Avignon were held in halls that still smelled faintly of lime and cut timber, the plasterwork not yet fully dry. Some still question whether Clement chose Avignon for strategic independence, as a diplomatic compromise with France, or simply out of convenience, remains a matter of scholarly discussion. The idea of Avignon as a papal seat was not yet formalized in 1307, but its advantages were clear to anyone who studied a map. It lay close to the French border, within reach of royal influence, yet technically outside direct French sovereignty, under the suzerainty of the King of Naples in his role as Count of Provence. This allowed Clement a measure of plausible autonomy, while ensuring that he remained accessible to Philip's envoys. As the winter set in, Clement weighed his options. A public rebuke of the French king for his unilateral action against the Templars could fracture the delicate peace between crown and tiara, reigniting the old antagonisms that had plagued Boniface. On the other hand, to simply endorse the arrests without independent inquiry would reduce the papacy to a rubber stamp for royal policy. Clement's instinct was to proceed with care, slower than Philip might wish, but steady enough to maintain the appearance of control. In the corridors of his current residence, Seine, for conversations turned in hushed tones to the logistics of inquiry. Who would be appointed to examine the charges, where the hearings would be held, how much authority to grant to local inquisitors versus papal envoys. Scrolls bearing the names of experienced canon lawyers were unrolled on Clement's desk, their margins annotated with notes in a tidy, deliberate hand. Avignon entered the conversation as a practical center from which to coordinate such efforts. Its river port connected it to the Rhône Valley and the Mediterranean trade routes. Its walls provided security. Its clergy and notaries could be mustered without the volatile politics of Rome. To Clement, still mindful of the collapse in Lyon and the fragility of grand designs, such stability was not a luxury, but a necessity. For those close to the papal court, the move toward Avignon was also a shift in atmosphere. The city was smaller than Rome, more provincial in its rhythms. Merchants from the surrounding countryside mingled with courtiers in the markets. The scent of rosemary and garlic from Provençal kitchens drifted through the streets. In the evenings, the Rhône reflected the lantern light in restless ripples, a reminder that even in stillness, currents moved unseen. Clement's decision to investigate rather than condemn outright was a statement in itself. It signaled to the king that the papacy would not be rushed, and to the Templars that their case was not yet closed. But it also committed the Pope to a path where each step would be watched by both sides, and where any misstep could be framed as partiality. In the long candlelit hours, as clerks copied reports and messengers were dispatched to dioceses, Clement was said to pause at the open window of his chamber, looking out toward the direction of Avignon. The air carried the smell of damp earth and river silt, and the faint toll of a distant bell. Whether he saw in that horizon the promise of a safe harbor or the pull of another man's tide is something the records do not tell. What is certain is that the tide was already carrying voices toward him, voices that would speak in stone rooms under oath, their words inked into parchment as the first confessions were taken. The first interrogations of the Templars in France took place not in grand courts, but in rooms that smelled of stone and damp wool. These were not spaces designed for ceremony. They were chambers meant for containment, with narrow windows that admitted only thin light and thick doors that shut with a sound like the closing of a coffer. In these confined halls, the work of turning accusation into confession began. Royal officers and ecclesiastical inquisitors shared the task, sometimes working together, sometimes in uneasy sequence. The procedures followed were those set out in canon law for heresy cases, rules that allowed for the use of torture under specific limits, though in practice the boundaries often blurred. The accused were sworn to tell the truth, hands placed upon the Gospels, their eyes meeting the faces of men who already held their fate in ink and seal. Historical record tells us that inquisitorial procedures of the early 14th century permitted torture under certain conditions, and many Templar confessions in France were obtained this way. One curious note is that scribes recording testimony often repeated the phrase "dixit et recognovit," he said and acknowledged, like a refrain marking each admission in neat, unwavering script. Some still question whether how much weight can be given to confessions made under duress, and how many Templars retracted their words once free of immediate threat. The process could stretch for hours. A question would be posed, the answer noted, and then the question rephrased, probing for a change in detail. The same topics returned again and again: the initiation rite, the presence or absence of a crucifix, the nature of vows, the alleged worship of an idol. When answers were deemed unsatisfactory or evasive, the interrogators could order the application of the cord, the rack, or other devices meant to loosen tongues. Some brothers, faced with such measures, gave the words their interrogators sought, hoping for leniency or simply an end to the pain. Others held fast to their denials, even as the strain left them faint or speechless. A few, broken in body, murmured assent to whatever was put to them, their voices barely carrying to the scribe's desk. In Paris, the great hall of the temple itself became an interrogation site before the prisoners were dispersed to other facilities. Tables were set up for notaries, candles guttered in the drafts from ill-fitting shutters, and guards stood at the ready. Outside, the life of the city went on. Merchants haggled over fish at the quay. Apprentices ran errands. Church bells marked the hours. Inside, the rhythm was slower, dictated by the scrape of quills and the shifting of chains. For Clement V, the early reports from these sessions presented a complicated picture. Some confessions seemed damning, admissions of spitting on the cross, of denying Christ at initiation, of secret words spoken before a carved head. Others were vague or contradictory, undermining the neat coherence the king's case required. The Pope's own envoys, not yet deployed in full, would later find even greater variance when they conducted their inquiries outside of France. Among the peculiarities noted in the records are small marginal marks, notarial flourishes that might have been doodles, or coded signals about the credibility of a statement. In one surviving folio, a tiny hand with an outstretched finger, called a manicule, points to a sentence in which a brother claims he was told to obey the master above all else. Such symbols, silent to the accused, spoke to the clerks and their superiors about what was worth attention. The atmosphere in these rooms was not one of open debate, but of managed narrative. Each confession, true or coerced, was a brick in the structure the crown sought to build. Yet the very act of recording them, on parchment that could survive centuries, meant that future eyes would be able to read between the lines, to see the patterns of pressure and resistance. By the winter of 1307-1308, the rhythm of questioning had become a drumbeat in the lives of the imprisoned Templars. Days were counted not by the bells of the canonical hours, but by the summons to the questioning room, the creak of the chair, the first question asked in the same measured tone as before. And in these rooms, beneath the flicker of candles and the faint smell of smoke from distant hearths, the gap between what was spoken and what was true widened into a chasm, one that even the Pope's later inquiries would struggle to bridge. Yet beyond the reach of the king's officers, other rooms awaited, stone chambers at Chinon, where the Pope's own envoys would sit and listen. In the summer of 1308, nearly a year after the mass arrests, a different kind of inquiry unfolded in the fortress of Chinon, perched on a rise above the Vienne River in central France. The air there was lighter than in Paris, the streets quieter, the surrounding countryside brushed with the green of vineyards and the slow gold of ripening grain. But inside the castle's thick walls, the atmosphere was taut. This was not a royal court, but a place where papal authority, at last, would take its own measure of the Templar case. Clement V had dispatched 3 cardinals, Berenger Frédol, Étienne de Suisy, and Landolfo Brancacci, as his commissioners. Their task was to hear directly from the highest-ranking imprisoned Templars, including the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charnay, and other senior officers. The choice of Chinon was deliberate. It was a royal fortress, but in this matter the commissioners answered to the Pope, not to Philip IV. For a brief moment, the balance of jurisdiction tilted toward the papacy. Historical record tells us that in August 1308, papal envoys conducted interrogations of Templar leaders at Chinon, resulting in a document, later known as the Chinon Parchment, that recorded their confessions and granted absolution from heresy. One curious note is that the parchment itself vanished into Vatican archives for centuries and was only rediscovered in 2001, its script still crisp, its seal impressions faint but intact. Some still question whether the absolution granted at Chinon was intended to save the order as an institution or merely to reconcile the individuals spiritually while leaving the political suppression intact. The Chinon sessions were conducted with more formality than the earlier royal examinations. The accused were brought before the commissioners in a large vaulted chamber, the light falling unevenly from high windows. They swore on the Gospels to speak truthfully, then recounted the charges against them and their responses. Without the immediate presence of royal sergeants or the sharper instruments of coercion, some spoke more freely, though the weight of months in captivity still shadowed their words. De Molay admitted that, upon initiation decades earlier, he had been instructed to symbolically renounce Christ. Not in his heart, he insisted, but as part of a test of obedience. Others acknowledged similar rituals, which they described as symbolic or misunderstood. On the charge of idol worship, the answers were more evasive. Some denied knowledge entirely. Others spoke of relics or images that might have been mistaken for idols. The commissioners listened, noted, and questioned, their scribes bending over long tables to capture each exchange in the formal Latin of church records. The refrain "Dixit et recognovit" appeared again, but here it was joined by longer narrative notes, preserving not just the admissions, but the qualifications and denials. When the hearings concluded, the cardinals pronounced a form of absolution. The accused were forgiven for acts of heresy they had confessed, reconciled to the Church, and restored to communion. It was a remarkable act. On paper, it meant that the Pope's highest representatives had not found them unredeemable. Yet the absolution did not translate into freedom or restoration of the order's standing. The Chinon record was sent to the Pope, then filed away. In the political arena, Philip IV's charges and the broader process against the Templars rolled on. The grand absolution, sealed in wax and ribbon, became a document without a voice, its impact muffled by the fact that it remained out of sight for centuries. Historians still debate Clement's intent. Was the absolution a genuine attempt to save the Templars spiritually, while buying time to negotiate their institutional survival? Or was it a calculated gesture, clearing the individual's consciences while leaving the king's suppression unopposed? The parchment does not answer. It records what was said, not why it was done. For the men at Chinon, the outcome must have been bittersweet. They left the hearings with the blessing of the Church, but returned to their cells as prisoners of the crown. The keys that locked their doors were still in royal hands. The fortress stood solid above the Vienne, its towers catching the evening light. But for those inside, the view from the narrow windows was only of the courtyard stones and the slow passing of guards. In the quiet after the commissioners departed, the chamber at Chinon retained the scent of beeswax and ink. The parchment, rolled and tied, carried away by clerks, would rest in darkness for 7 centuries before seeing daylight again. Meanwhile, beyond Chinon's walls, the broader machinery of interrogation ground on, blending pain, procedure, and paper into a record as heavy as the accusations themselves. The inquiries into the Templars did not end with the high-profile sessions at Chinon. Across France and beyond, a slower, more grinding process continued in diocesan halls, castle chambers, and monastic guest houses pressed into service as makeshift courtrooms. Here, the papal mandate to investigate met the royal determination to convict, and the result was a blend of ecclesiastical formality and prosecutorial persistence. Interrogations followed the procedural outlines established in canon law. Witnesses sworn in on the Gospels, questions posed in a prescribed order, answers recorded by notaries trained to keep their script as clear as their conscience would allow. Yet the process was not untouched by the harsher tools of secular justice. The quaestio per tormenta, questioning under torture, was permitted when judges believed the accused withheld truth, provided they had half proof from other evidence. Historical record tells us that diocesan inquiries varied widely in method, with some, like those in England, eschewing torture, while in France it was frequently used to elicit confessions. One curious note is that the iron gall ink used by scribes often left a faint metallic scent on the parchment, so that some documents still carry a ghost of that smell today. Some still question whether the actual number of Templars executed across Europe remains uncertain. Local records differ, and not all sentences were carried out to the same severity. In France, the methods were rarely gentle. The rack stretched joints until pain alone compelled speech. The strappato hoisted a man by his wrists, bound behind his back, letting him fall short of the floor in wrenching jerks. Lesser measures included binding cords, twisted tightly around arms or legs until flesh swelled and sensation dimmed. For some, the mere presence of these devices in the chamber was enough to change their testimony. The scribes were careful to note the sequence of questions and answers, but seldom the circumstances under which they were given. A confession might appear on parchment as a calm admission, the ink flowing evenly, the Latin formula unchanged from any other deposition. The strain in the voice, the sweat on the brow, the trembling hands, these were not part of the official record. Clement V, reading reports from different regions, would have seen stark contrasts. In England, where Edward II was initially skeptical of the charges, the inquiries proceeded without torture, and many brothers were acquitted or given light penances. In Aragon and Portugal, the pace was slower and verdicts more mixed. In France, however, the pattern was consistent. Confessions aligned with the royal case and retractions, if they came, were often disregarded as the words of relapsed heretics. The paperwork generated by these inquiries was immense. Rolls of parchment filled with depositions were stored in chests alongside inventories of seized goods. Each was tagged with a strip of parchment bearing the name of the accused and the place of testimony. In some dioceses, these bundles were kept under triple lock, one key with the bishop, one with the royal official, one with the notary, ensuring that access was as controlled as the process itself. Among the more curious surviving documents are marginal notes that reveal the fatigue of the clerks. Beside the 37th repetition of a standard question, one scribe scrawled a tiny drawing of a candle with its flame bending, as if noting both the literal draft in the room and the slow guttering of his own patience. For the accused, the repetition of procedure could be as wearing as the moments of pain. Day after day, the same questions returned. Did you renounce Christ? Did you spit on the cross? Did you worship a head or idol? The answers might change under strain, or stay the same until the interrogator tired of asking. Either way, each word was captured in the smooth lines of clerical Latin, soon to be folded into the larger case against the order. The cumulative effect was a record that looked, on its surface, authoritative. Hundreds of confessions, many in similar language, all pointing toward guilt. But beneath that surface lay the truth that procedure and pain had worked together to shape the narrative. Paper preserved the words. It could not preserve the will behind them. By early 1309, this machinery of inquiry had become a fixture in France. The cells remained full, the notaries busy, the questions unchanging. And in certain coastal towns, another kind of murmur began to stir, of ships and sails, and the possibility that some brothers, and perhaps some treasures, had escaped the king's reach altogether. Those murmurs would follow the tide to harbors where the sea itself seemed to keep the order's secrets. La Rochelle sat on France's western shore like a sentinel facing the Atlantic, its harbor cupped by stout stone towers and protected by tides that locals knew as intimately as the streets of their own quarter. In 1307, the port was still an important link in the chain of Templar logistics, a place where cargo from the Mediterranean or England could be received, stored, and redistributed inland. Salt from nearby pans, wool from the interior, wine from Bordeaux, all passed through its quays. But it was the order's ships, moored or at anchor beyond the harbor mouth, that kept tongues wagging in the wake of the arrests. When word reached La Rochelle of the king's sweep against the Templars, the local commandery found itself in the same position as those in the interior: gates sealed, brothers detained, goods inventoried. Yet the sea presented a complication the king's writ could not entirely master. Vessels could slip away in the night, sails swelling with the offshore breeze, hulls carrying whatever, or whomever, could be loaded quickly enough. Historical record tells us that La Rochelle was a significant Templar port on the Atlantic coast of France, serving as a logistical hub for the order's European and Mediterranean operations. One curious note is that the salt pans near the harbor gave the wind a faint tang that clung to clothes and hair, so that even inland travelers could guess where a man had been. Some still question whether the enduring story that a Templar fleet escaped from La Rochelle in 1307 laden with treasure remains unsupported by contemporary records, but persistent in legend. Chroniclers of the time are silent on any great departure from the port, yet within a generation the idea took root that in the days before the arrests, a number of the order's ships had sailed westward and vanished. Some tales sent them to Scotland, others to Portugal, others still to lands uncharted by European maps. In these stories, the treasure varied: gold and silver in some versions, sacred relics in others, or even the accumulated archives of the order's secrets. For the people of La Rochelle, the truth was likely more mundane. The king's officers arrived, took control of the Templar properties, and inventoried the ships just as they had inventoried the mules, the harnesses, and the barrels of wine. Yet the sight of masts against a dawn sky could not help but feed speculation. A single ship leaving at the right hour could be transformed, in retelling, into a fleet bound for mystery. Clement V received no firm evidence of any such escape. Reports from his bishops along the coast described seizures of vessels and cargoes, but no armada breaking away under the Red Cross. Still, the rumors traveled inland, faster than any official missive. They were embroidered in taverns, carried by merchants, and whispered in the antechambers of courts where the Templars still had sympathizers. The symbolism of the sea in these stories was potent. On land, the king's power was near absolute. his reach extending through castles, towns, and fields. At sea, the horizon was a line beyond which neither writ nor seal could easily follow. For a brother of the order dreaming of escape, the sound of gulls and the smell of salt might seem like an invitation. Even if no treasure fleet ever departed, the sea remained a quiet accomplice in the Templar legacy. Long after the trials ended, mariners' tales and local lore kept alive the idea that somewhere, beyond the curve of the world, the order's wealth and mission endured. The Atlantic became not just a body of water, but a mirror for hope, loss, and the human appetite for stories that promise more than the eye can prove. In the harbor itself, the daily work continued. Ropes coiled, sails patched, barrels rolled along planks. Fishermen mended their nets and traded gossip with dockhands who had once hauled cargo for the Templars. The towers kept watch over a sea that had seen crusader galleys and merchant cogs, and would see many more. But for those who stood at the edge of the quay that winter, staring westward into the pale light, it was easy to imagine that somewhere out there, a ship still carried the cross, riding the endless swell toward an unseen shore. Far from the salt air, in a town beside the Rhone, the Pope prepared to summon the bishops and lawyers who would decide the order's fate in the echo of a council hall. The Rhone Valley in winter carries a chill that cuts through wool and fur alike, driven by the Mistral wind that funnels between the mountains. In late 1311, that wind accompanied bishops, abbots, theologians, and envoys as they made their way toward the town of Vienne, just south of Lyon, for a gathering that promised to shape the future of Christendom. The Council of Vienne had been called by Clement V, and at its heart, though not its only business, was the question of the Knights Templar. The town itself strained to contain the influx, its narrow streets filled with pack animals, carts, and the clatter of armed escorts. Hostels, abbeys, and even private homes took in delegates, their hearths working overtime to push back the damp cold. In the great church of St. Maurice, where the council would convene, carpenters raised platforms and long benches, while scribes arranged desks for the recording of proceedings. The smell of fresh-cut timber mingled with incense from daily services. Historical record tells us that the Council of Vienne opened in October 1311 under Pope Clement V, with among its chief concerns the fate of the Knights Templar. One curious note is that delegates warmed their hands over portable braziers set along the aisles of the council hall, the coals glowing like scattered embers beneath the vaulted roof. Some still question whether, had the Templar defense been allowed full presentation, might the council have reached a different verdict than the Pope eventually issued? The arrival of delegates was an event in itself. Cardinals in crimson robes moved through the streets like slow-burning coals. Bishops in black or purple cloaks formed clusters, their mitres bobbing above the crowd. Behind them came clerks burdened with rolls of parchment, chests of documents, and the practical luggage of men who might be away from home for months. Among the topics on the agenda were reform of religious orders, the problem of the Beguines and Beghards, and proposals for a new crusade. But it was the Templar matter that drew the most anticipation. Philip IV's representatives arrived well prepared. They carried dossiers of accusations, records of confessions, and inventories of seized property. They also carried the weight of the king's political expectation that the council would ratify what his courts had already set in motion. The Templar defenders, fewer in number and hampered by imprisonment, had sent petitions for the opportunity to speak, some of which reached the Pope's hands. Clement's role as convener placed him at the center of a delicate balance. Publicly, he presented the council as a gathering to weigh evidence and deliberate in the light of faith. Privately, he knew that the longer the matter lingered, the greater the strain on relations with the French crown. He was also mindful of the varied attitudes among the attending clergy. Some saw the Templars as victims of royal overreach, others as a scandal demanding swift excision. The opening sessions in St. Maurice were formal, almost ceremonial. The delegates processed into the nave, took their assigned places, and listened as the Pope's legates outlined the council's purposes. Outside, the Rhone flowed gray and fast, its banks lined with bare trees rattling in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with breath and the crackle of braziers. Witnesses would be heard, documents examined, and arguments made, but not all at once, and not all in open forum. In the evenings, after the day's formalities, smaller gatherings met in heated chambers to discuss strategy. Some bishops argued that the evidence against the Templars was insufficient for outright suppression. Others believed that even the taint of such charges was too great to risk leaving the order intact. For the citizens of Vienne, the council brought bustle and profit. Bakers rose before dawn to feed the demand for bread. Vintners opened casks for noble and clerical guests. Tailors stitched extra cloaks against the cold. Yet even in the marketplace, the talk was of the Templars, their guilt or innocence, their fate, and the rumored treasure that might vanish into royal coffers. Clement moved between these worlds, the public face of papal authority, the private reader of reports, the careful listener to counsel from both allies and rivals. As winter deepened, he must have known that the question of the Templars would not be decided by the council's debate alone, but by his own hand when the time came to seal the outcome. That outcome remained uncertain as the arguments wound on, the voices of caution and condemnation vying beneath the cathedral's high arches. The Council of Vienne settled into a rhythm as the days shortened and the winter deepened. In the mornings, the great nave of St. Maurice filled with the muffled shuffle of robes and the scratch of quills as notaries readied themselves to record testimony. Delegates sat wrapped in heavy cloaks, their breath faintly visible in the chill air despite the braziers stationed along the aisles. Each day's session carried the weight of expectation that perhaps this would be the day when the question of the Templars edged toward resolution. But the debates moved like a slow river in frost, surface glinting, yet progress beneath barely visible. Evidence was read aloud, sometimes in dry lists of confiscated goods, sometimes in the charged words of a confession. Then came the counterpoints, arguments about the reliability of testimony extracted under duress, about the absence of uniform guilt across Christendom, about the service the order had rendered over nearly 2 centuries. Historical record tells us that the Council of Vienne did not immediately condemn the Templars. Conflicting regional reports and legal arguments prolonged deliberations into early 1312. One curious note is that alongside the Templar hearings, delegates also debated the status of the Beguines and Beghards, with some bishops keeping separate color-coded rolls of arguments for different issues. Some still question whether the council's hesitation a sign of genuine doubt about the Templars' guilt or a political stalling tactic until the Pope could act without open confrontation. In the formal sessions, speakers adhered to order, each rising in turn, voice carrying across the stone to those gathered under the cathedral's vault. Some favored suppression, citing the potential scandal of leaving the order intact even if a minority were guilty. Others urged reform rather than dissolution, arguing that disbanding the Templars would squander valuable resources for defending the Holy Land or aiding the poor. The Pope listened more than he spoke. Clement V's place at the center of the hall was both literal and symbolic. He was the arbiter who had convened this assembly, yet the decision would ultimately rest with him alone. His demeanor betrayed little, though observers noted that he often fingered the end of his stole, while others argued, a habit perhaps of patience or quiet calculation. Outside the formal sessions, conversations took on a different tone. In smaller chambers warmed by enclosed hearths, clusters of bishops and envoys spoke more freely. Here one might admit skepticism about the charges, or voice concern over the crown's growing influence over ecclesiastical matters. Others confided that, regardless of truth, the political tide favored Philip IV, and resisting it would be costly. The Templar defense suffered from absence. Most of their leaders were imprisoned, their voices replaced by petitions and memoranda submitted on their behalf. A few sympathetic clerics read these aloud to the assembly, but without the presence of the accused to answer questions directly, their impact was muted. Meanwhile, the council's other business proceeded. Discussions about launching a new crusade competed for time, as did deliberations over various church reforms. Delegates drifted between topics, the Templar matter sometimes set aside for days, only to return with the same unresolved questions. The constant shifting of focus gave the impression of motion without forward movement. For the townspeople of Vienne, the council's indecision was a kind of theater without a climax. They heard rumors of votes taken, verdicts reached, only to learn the next morning that nothing had been decided. Tavern keepers and merchants profited from the prolonged stay of visitors, but even they began to wonder how long the debates could continue without conclusion. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Clement V held his cards close. He allowed the process to run, gathering the arguments, noting the divisions, perhaps waiting for the moment when he could act in a way that would preserve papal dignity while accommodating the crown's will. The council hall, with its echoing arches and long shadows, became less a place of verdict than a stage on which delay itself was the central performance. By early 1312, it was clear that consensus would not emerge from the floor of the council. The voices had been heard, the parchment stacked high, but the matter's weight had shifted toward the Pope's own desk. Whatever decision came next would bear his seal alone. And when that seal finally pressed into warm wax, it would dissolve an order with words measured to preserve the Church's peace. On the morning of 22nd of March 1312, Clement V's decision took physical form in the papal bull vox in excelso. Drafted in careful Latin, rolled and tied with ribbon, and sealed with lead, it carried the authority not of a council's consensus, but of the Pope himself. The cathedral debates at Vienne had failed to produce a unanimous verdict. Clement chose instead to act by decree, framing his words in the language of unity and caution. The opening lines invoked God's name and the welfare of the Church, setting a tone of solemn necessity. The Templar order, Clement declared, had been publicly and notoriously accused of grave offenses. Even if some charges were disputed, the scandal and suspicion were too great to allow the order to continue. For the peace of the faithful, the order was dissolved, not by a definitive sentence of guilt, but by a measure of apostolic ordinance. Historical record tells us that Vox in Excelso, issued by Clement V on 22 March 1312, formally dissolved the Order of the Temple without declaring it definitively guilty of heresy. One curious note is that the leaden seal of a papal bull, or bulla, was often impressed on both sides, one with the faces of Saints Peter and Paul, the other with the reigning pope's name, creating a small palm-sized emblem of authority. Some still question whether Clement's phrasing was an act of prudence to avoid declaring the order heretical without incontrovertible proof, or a calculated way to meet Philip IV's demands without entirely surrendering papal prerogative. The distinction was subtle, but important. By avoiding a formal condemnation for heresy, Clement left room to absolve individual members, as he had already done in the Chinon proceedings. Yet by dissolving the order outright, he removed any possibility of its corporate survival. The lands, churches, and revenues that had sustained the Templars for nearly 2 centuries were to be reassigned in theory to the Knights Hospitaller. Copies of the bull were dispatched to bishops and secular rulers across Christendom. In each city, the arrival of a papal document was an event, the seal examined, the ribbon handled with care, the parchment read aloud before clerics and civic leaders. Some listeners greeted the news with satisfaction, others with quiet unease. In places far from France, where Templars had been less harshly treated, the decision felt abrupt. In the council city of Vienne, the bull was received with mixed reactions. Philip IV's envoys could claim victory. The order was no more. Supporters of the Templars, though few in open number, found some solace in the absence of an outright heresy verdict. To the neutral observer, Clement's wording was a study in papal diplomacy, an act that granted the crown its political goal while maintaining the Church's judicial dignity. The crafting of such a bull was itself a ritual. Scribes worked from drafts corrected in the Pope's own hand or by trusted cardinals. The parchment was cut from the smoothest skins, the ink chosen for permanence, the script formal and legible to trained eyes. Once sealed, the bull became immutable. Its authority carried as much in its physical presence as in its words. Yet for the Templars who still sat in cells, the subtleties of legal phrasing mattered little. They heard only that the order was gone, its name struck from papal rolls, its properties destined for others. Whether they were personally absolved or condemned, the brotherhood to which they had sworn their lives no longer existed in the eyes of the Church. In Rome, the issuance of such a decree might have been accompanied by a public ceremony. In Vienne, the moment passed with less spectacle. The bull was read, entered into record, and dispatched, the Pope turning to other matters even as the implications of his act began to ripple outward. Still, the image endures of cords drawn tight, and a lead bulla impressed, its faces cooling into permanence, capturing the finality of the decision. What had begun with keys turning in locks on an October dawn in 1307 now reached its formal end in the steady pressure of a hand sealing a document. But parchment could declare intent. It could not ensure compliance. And soon another bull would address the question of who would truly hold the Templars' scattered wealth. Barely weeks after Vox in Excelso dissolved the Templar order, Clement V issued another bull, Ad Providam, dated 2 May 1312. If the first had ended the order's existence, the second sought to decide the fate of its vast resources, lands, churches, mills, ports, treasuries, and the complex web of rents and rights that made the Templars one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. On parchment, the solution was clear. Nearly all these holdings were to pass to the Knights Hospitaller, the other great military order of the Church, to be used in defense of the Holy Land and care for the sick. The reasoning was pragmatic. The Hospitallers had a long record of service and were untainted by the Templar scandal. By transferring assets rather than dispersing them piecemeal, the Pope could preserve their intended military and charitable functions. But what papal ink declared, political reality often resisted. Across Europe, kings and local lords had their own designs on Templar wealth, and Philip IV of France was foremost among them. Historical record tells us that the papal bull Ad Providam granted most Templar property to the Hospitallers, but in practice much remained in secular hands for years. One curious note is that some Hospitaller records from the period still list Templar properties with their old names, the Templelite, for decades after the transfer, as if the stones themselves resisted rebranding. Some still question whether Clement genuinely expected the Hospitallers to receive all the property, or whether he recognized from the start that powerful monarchs would keep much for themselves. In France, Philip extracted significant expenses from the transfer before allowing Hospitaller possession. Other rulers, from England's Edward II to Portugal's Denis, negotiated terms that kept certain lands or revenues under royal control. In the Crown of Aragon, the transition was slow and piecemeal, with former Templar knights sometimes joining the Hospitallers and bringing their local commanderies with them. The mechanics of the transfer were cumbersome. Hospitaller representatives had to present the papal bull to local authorities, verify inventories, and physically take possession of sites, often over the protests of officials who claimed unpaid debts or pending disputes. In some cases, Templar buildings stood empty for years, their chapels unserved, their halls echoing. In others, the Hospitallers moved in quickly, keeping much of the old staff and simply changing the banners over the gates. In Avignon, where Clement had begun to establish the papal court, the bull's effect was largely symbolic. The Pope had made his decision. Its enforcement was left to a patchwork of local actions. Reports returned to him irregularly. A preceptory secured here, a mill transferred there, a stubborn sheriff refusing to yield in another place. The slow churn of property law and feudal privilege made a mockery of the sweeping certainty with which Ad Providam was written. Still, the bull's language reinforced the image of papal control. It spoke of providence, stewardship, and the continuity of holy service. The Hospitallers, for their part, embraced their new role, even if they never quite received all that had been promised. By mid-century, they were firmly established as the inheritors of much, though not all, of the Templars' physical legacy. For the ordinary people living near these properties, the change was often subtle. A different emblem on a shield, a new master at the head of processions, perhaps a shift in how rents were collected or alms distributed. The buildings themselves, the round churches, the fortified barns, the sturdy halls, remained, weathering as they always had. In the shadow of these transactions, the last imprisoned Templars faded from view. Some were absorbed into other orders, others lived out their days in quiet penance, and a few, stubborn or condemned, met harsher ends. The legal fiction of a smooth transfer masked the messier truth that dissolving an order on parchment was one thing, but erasing it from the landscape of Christendom was something else entirely. And in Paris, where the Seine curved past the Ile de la Cité, one former knight still waited in chains for a reckoning that would come not in council halls, but in firelight. By the early months of 1314, Jacques de Molay had been a prisoner for more than 6 years. Once Grand Master of the Knights Templar, commander of men across continents, he now occupied a narrow cell in Paris, hemmed in by damp stone and the slow decay of age and confinement. The chill from the Seine seemed to seep into the walls themselves, curling into the straw of his bedding and lingering in his bones. The Ile de la Cité, heart of the French capital, held not only the royal palace and Notre Dame, but also the prisons where high-ranking captives awaited judgment. From the barred slit of his window, de Molay might have glimpsed the cathedral's towers rising above the rooftops, their bells marking the hours as his world shrank to measured steps and muffled footsteps in the corridor. Historical record tells us that Jacques de Molay, elected Grand Master of the Templars around 1292, was captured in the mass arrests of October 1307 and remained imprisoned in France until his execution in March 1314. One curious note is that medieval Parisian prisons often allowed high-ranking prisoners to receive visitors and modest comforts, cushions, better food, even books, if they had friends or patrons willing to pay the guards. Some still question whether de Molay's long imprisonment was intended to pressure him into a final public confession, or simply to keep him sidelined until the political moment was ripe for execution. In these years of waiting, the world outside changed. The order he had led was officially gone, its properties seized or reassigned. Former brothers had been dispersed, some joining the Hospitallers, others fading into secular life. The political storm that had once raged in councils and courts had quieted, but its embers still glowed in the king's determination to end the matter on his own terms. Accounts of de Molay's imprisonment vary. Some suggest he was held with Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, in conditions that allowed them to speak and pray together. Others place him in stricter isolation. It is likely he had access to a chaplain or sympathetic cleric, for even in the tightest confinement, the Church maintained its presence over souls as well as bodies. As Grand Master, de Molay had been accustomed to audiences with kings, strategizing with military commanders, negotiating with merchants for fleets and provisions. Now his audience was the jailer, his strategy confined to enduring the day. The symbolism of keys returned here, no longer the ceremonial keys of office he might once have carried, but the iron keys that turned against him, locking him in, each turning a reminder of power reversed. Philip IV's court had not forgotten him. The king, nearing the end of his own reign, sought a resolution that would reinforce his authority and close the Templar chapter without ambiguity. In March 1314, a public ceremony was planned. De Molay and several other leaders would be brought before an assembly to hear their sentences, confess their guilt once more, and receive commuted punishments of life imprisonment. The stage was set for closure, the outcome already scripted. Yet de Molay had shown before that he was not a man to follow a script if it betrayed his conscience. At Chinon, he had confessed to certain initiation rites, but denied the deeper charges of heresy. Now, with the final act approaching, he faced a choice: accept the prepared narrative and live out his days in captivity, or speak in defiance and risk death. Paris moved on around him, barges sliding along the Seine, merchants shouting prices in the streets, apprentices clattering down alleys. But within the prison, time felt different. The waiting was both a reprieve and a torment. Each day that passed without summons could be a gift or a threat, each meal a reminder that he was alive only at the pleasure of others. In this narrowing world, perhaps de Molay turned inward, recalling the deserts of Syria, the bustling ports of Cyprus, the solemn vows taken before the altar. The chains at his wrists and ankles would have been cold, but the memory of command, of riding under the Red Cross, of carrying the sword not for himself but for a cause, might have been the warmth that remained. When the summons finally came, it led not to the quiet walls of lifelong confinement, but to the open air of an island, where fire would speak the last word. On the afternoon of 18th of March 1314, a small procession crossed the short span from the royal palace on the Ile de la Cité to a scaffold erected on the western tip of the island. The place was known as the Ile aux Juifs, the island of the Jews, a gravelly bank between the river's current and the walls of the city, long used for executions. That day, it was to bear witness to the end of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, were brought forth under guard, chains clinking in the spring air. The plan, according to the king's design, was simple. The condemned would publicly reaffirm their earlier confessions, accept the judgment of life imprisonment, and be led away to obscurity. But when the moment came to speak, both men defied the script. Historical record tells us that on the 18th of March 1314, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were burned at the stake in Paris after retracting their previous confessions and proclaiming the order's innocence. One curious note is that contemporary Parisian chronicles note that the scent of burning wood often mingled with the smell of the Seine's mudflats at low tide, a detail that lent executions here a distinctive atmosphere. Some still question whether the exact words of de Molay's final statement are disputed. Later accounts embroidered them into a curse against Philip IV and Pope Clement V, possibly a legend born after both men died within the year. Before the assembled crowd, which included curious townsfolk, royal officials, and perhaps some of the same clerics who had judged them, de Molay spoke with a voice that, witnesses claimed, carried clearly over the river. He declared that he and his brothers had been wrongfully condemned, that the order was pure, and that those who had forced false confessions would face divine judgment. De Charnay followed with similar words. Their refusal to comply shattered the careful staging of the king's resolution. Public defiance could not be left unanswered. Philip ordered immediate execution. The men were bound to stakes, pyres hastily prepared around them. The wood crackled as torches touched the kindling, smoke rising into the pale sky. For those on the bridges or banks, the scene would have been stark. Two figures against the fluttering flames, the river flowing dark and cold beside them. The Ile de la Cité's towers cast long shadows over the water, and the sound of bells from Notre Dame may have reached the island, tolling the hour even as the fire consumed its prisoners. Chroniclers differed on how the end came. Some wrote that de Molay prayed aloud, commending his soul to God, the wind carrying his words. Others claimed he stood steadfast in silence, the flames climbing until he was hidden from sight. The river reflected the light of the fire, a trembling double image that drifted with the current toward the city's outer walls. In the years that followed, the story of that day grew. The notion of a curse that de Molay summoned Philip IV and Clement V to the judgment of God within the year appeared in later sources, feeding into the legend of the Templars as victims of injustice. It was true that both king and pope died within months, but whether this was divine retribution or coincidence remained, as always, a matter for belief. The site of the execution would change with the city. The Îlot Juif was eventually absorbed into the reconstructed western point of the Île de la Cité, its gravel shore gone beneath stone embankments. But for centuries, Parisian memory kept the association. Here the last Grand Master met the fire. Here the order's earthly story ended. When the smoke cleared and the crowd dispersed, only ash remained on the river wind, carrying whispers that would mingle with legend before the embers cooled. When the flames on the Îlot Juif sank to embers, the crowd that had gathered began to thin, spilling back into the streets and alleys of Paris. Some left in silence, heads bowed. Others spoke in low voices, repeating what they had heard from the condemned. A few embellished the words before they had even crossed the bridge, sowing seeds of a legend that would grow far beyond the city walls. The air along the quays was thick with the mingled smells of smoke and river mud. In nearby taverns, patrons leaned close over cups of wine to exchange versions of the event. Some swore de Molay had called upon God to judge his persecutors within a year, naming both Philip IV and Pope Clement V. Others insisted he had spoken only of the order's innocence, leaving the rest to divine justice. Historical record tells us that both Philip IV and Clement V died within the year following de Molay's execution, Clement in April 1314, Philip in November. One curious note is that certain Parisian stone masons claimed for decades afterward that the stones from the Îlot Juif retained a faint scorch mark that no scrubbing could remove, as if the fire had left its shadow. Some still question whether the curse was recorded by any eyewitness at the time, or was a later addition by chroniclers seeking a moral symmetry to the Templar story. Crowds are quick to turn moments into symbols. For many Parisians, the execution became a parable about justice and power, whether as a warning against royal overreach, a vindication of the king's firmness, or a mystery best left untouched. Even those who had little sympathy for the Templars could not ignore the strange swiftness with which fate seemed to follow the two most powerful men in Christendom. In the months that followed, the papal court mourned Clement V, who died in Rocamadour, far from the public stage. The French crown mourned Philip IV, who died after a hunting accident. Both deaths were natural enough in cause, yet the proximity to de Molay's fiery end lent them a pattern that storytellers eagerly claimed as divine design. Legends have a way of shaping stone as well as memory. Guides in later centuries would point to the western tip of the Île de la Cité and speak of the Templars' curse, even as the river's course and the island's shape shifted with the city's growth. Some said the cobblestones there felt colder to the touch than elsewhere, especially in March, as if the season remembered the day. Cold stones and whispered curses, these were the monuments de Molay left behind in Paris. No grand tomb, no relics sanctified by the church, only the enduring friction between history and legend. Scholars would debate his guilt or innocence. Poets and novelists would give him defiant speeches. Freemasons and conspiracists would weave him into their own origin tales. Yet to those who had stood on the bridges that day, the reality was simpler and sharper. Two men bound to stakes, fire rising. A voice over the wind. Whether prophecy or merely the final cry of a condemned knight, it was enough to mark the moment in the city's collective soul. While Paris held its memory in stone and smoke, across Europe the practical work of claiming the Templars' scattered houses continued, keys changing hands under quieter skies. In the months after the fire on the Seine, the machinery of property transfer ground on, slow and uneven. Across France, England, Iberia, and beyond, papal envoys and hospitaller representatives arrived at former Templar commanderies with sealed documents in hand, ready to take possession in accordance with ad providam. The image was meant to be orderly, a master key presented, a ledger signed, the hospitaller banner replacing the red cross of the temple. In practice, it was often a scene of locked gates, wary stewards, and accounts that did not match the parchment. The hospitallers, now the nominal heirs to the Templar estate, sent brothers skilled in administration as well as arms. They carried the authority of the Pope, but authority did not always unlock doors. In some places, local lords claimed the property as escheated to them. In others, royal officers had already seized the revenues for the crown. Even where cooperation was offered, the handover could be incomplete, outbuildings omitted, livestock lost, rents collected in advance and not forwarded. Historical record tells us that although ad providam granted Templar assets to the hospitallers, in many regions these transfers were delayed or reduced by secular claims, with disputes lasting decades. One curious note is that in some former Templar sites, hospitaller brothers reportedly continued using the same keys that had belonged to the temple, their iron teeth worn smooth by years of turning in the same locks. Some still question whether the hospitallers ever truly benefited from the transfer on the scale intended by the papacy, or if the real winners were the monarchs who held assets during the transition. The physical spaces told their own stories. Some commanderies stood almost as the Templars had left them, chapels swept, kitchens stocked, armories intact, awaiting only a change of occupants. Others were stripped bare, walls damp from neglect, gardens overgrown. In towns where the Templars had run mills or markets, the absence was felt quickly in commerce and charity alike. Hospitaller records from the 1320s and 1330s show the slow rebuilding of these holdings. Repairs to roofs, restocking of herds, re-establishment of local fairs, all undertaken under the black and white banner of the Order of St. John. Yet the shadow of the Red Cross lingered. Some villagers continued to call the sites the Temple, long after the Templar name had been erased from official rolls. In regions far from royal centers, the change of hands could be almost ceremonial. The hospitaller commander would arrive, perhaps with a small escort, present the bull, receive the symbolic keys from a local warden, and hold mass in the chapel. A fresh coat of paint might cover the old insignia, but the stones beneath were the same, weathered by the same wind. The absence of the former brothers was felt most keenly in rural communities, where the Templars had been both landlords and protectors. Hospitallers took up the role, but they came fewer in number. Their resources stretched across new acquisitions scattered across Europe. The efficiency and cohesion that had once defined the temple were not easily replicated in such a dispersed inheritance. For Clement V, the decree had been a solution on paper. For the hospitallers, it was a challenge on the ground. And for those who still remembered the Templars as neighbors, the sight of a new banner was a reminder that the old order had truly passed, leaving behind empty rooms that would be filled, but never in quite the same way. And yet, in some corners of Christendom, the rooms were not emptied at all, but repopulated by familiar faces under a different name. In Portugal, where the Atlantic presses a salt hand against the land and the Tagus gleams like a drawn blade at sunset, the story of the temple did not so much end as turn a corner. The crown and the church had closed the book elsewhere, its pages pressed flat by seals and decrees. But here a new chapter began in familiar handwriting. After years of petitions, consultations, and cautious choreography, King Denis of Portugal brought into being the Order of Christ, an institution that borrowed the bones of the Templar body while clothing them in a new vestment. The transformation was not accomplished in a single flourish. It came by increments, negotiations with the papacy, drafts of statutes, rehearsals of ceremony, and the careful transfer of men and means from one banner to another. The logic was practical. Portugal's frontiers needed guardians. Its roads needed safe conduct. Its revenues needed disciplined stewards. The Templar machine had served those purposes well. To dismantle it entirely would be to unteach a country how to do what it already knew. What changed was the crest on the shield and the destination of prayers. What persisted were the skills carried in hands that remembered. Historical record tells us that in 1319, Pope John XVIII approved King Denis's plan to found the Order of Christ, which absorbed many former Templars and a substantial portion of their properties within Portugal. One curious note is that early Order of Christ brothers kept account tablets scored with wax, as their predecessors had done, using a stylus with one end sharpened for numbers and the other flattened to smooth mistakes, erasures that, under candlelight, left a soft sheen like water on slate. Some still question whether how complete the continuity was between the Templars and the Order of Christ remains a matter of scholarly argument. Was it an authentic institutional rebirth, or a royal and papal fiction masking a pragmatic survival? In Tomar, where the Templars had once built a convent that seemed to braid earthly strength with heavenly ambition, the new order settled like a returning tide. The round church, its walls thick, its interior ringed with columns, kept its stone memory intact. Frescoes were retouched, altars rearranged, banners changed. Yet the footfalls on the flags sounded much the same, and the routines of the house were recognizable even to those who insisted on novelty. Men rose before dawn, chanted the offices, examined the ledgers of rents and mills, and walked the girdled fields to tally grain and olives under a sky the same color as yesterday. The Order of Christ did not announce itself with trumpets. It simply began doing work. It maintained the fortifications that guarded river crossings, administered estates whose rents underwrote alms and repairs, and offered seasoned riders to escort caravans through stretches of road troubled by brigands. The language of its rule spoke of humility and obedience, charity and defense of the realm. On parchment, the difference from the temple was clear. In the dust of a stable, in the rigging of a riverboat, in the counting room where coins clicked across a table edge, the continuity was harder to miss. Symbols shifted, as symbols will. The red cross that had once marked the Templars' surcoats found a cousin in the cross of the Order of Christ, shaped differently, tinted with a hue that would in later centuries spread across sails bound for horizons unknown. For now, the cross was smaller, stitched by careful hands, more promise than proclamation. Keys changed pockets, Ledgers changed headings. The wax on seals cooled under a different image. The men who kept those keys and turned those pages aged in service, as they would have done under the old banner, their habits of diligence outliving the words that named them. Beyond Portugal, the pattern echoed with variations. In the Crown of Aragon, former Templar sites found caretakers among the Hospitallers, while in Castile and elsewhere, royal designs created or strengthened local orders, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, absorbing functions and sometimes personnel, though not with the same directness Portugal achieved. Each polity solved the puzzle according to its own geometry of frontier, treasury, and fear. But nowhere did the solution feel as seamless as in Tomar, where the last Templar stones had already learned the language of the new order's prayers. If one stood in the chapter house there, midwinter, the ritual would have seemed a familiar braid of earth and heaven. A brazier glowed like a small sun. Iron bars turned orange, dropping their heat into the cold room. A clerk with steady hand read out accounts, the yield of a vineyard, the state of a bridge, the price of rye. A commander traced the day's tasks with a finger on a wax tablet, then smoothed a mistake until the surface shone. Outside the convent's cloister stones held the night's damp, and in the garden a few herbs persisted under straw covers, green hope tucked against frost. The sea kept its role in this quiet continuity. Although the age of voyages lay ahead, the Tagus and the Atlantic already tutored the order's instincts, a discipline of provisioning, a patience with weather, a readiness to move supplies and men by water when roads failed. Barges murmured against their moorings, ropes thudded softly against pilings, gulls cut thin crescents across a pale sky, salt clung to cloaks, to beards, to ledgers carried too close to a spray-laced gunwale. The Order of Christ learned to read the river's moods, as it had once read a battlefield's, where to wait, where to press, where to let the current do the work. There were, of course, adjustments. The older ethos of a crusading army, unmoored from a Holy Land battlefield, yielded to something more domestic and administrative, to a stewardship that looked inward rather than east. Yet even that inwardness had a horizon to it, a habit of surveying, of measuring distances, and calculating provisions made the leap from land campaigns to logistical projects with hardly a stutter. When bridges needed mending, when new mills required sighting along narrow streams, the order's captains argued their cases with the same calm firmness they had once used to plan a siege. Not everyone approved or accepted the continuity. Some clerics insisted that the temple suppression required a stricter discontinuity, a moral reassembly, that the Order of Christ's resemblance to its predecessor threatened to blur. Some layfolk, still loyal to stories of Templar generosity or fearsome in memory of their authority, bridled at the notion that a new label could absolve old power. Yet the fields needed plowing, roads needed guarding, and alms needed distributing. Practical needs speak a grammar older than polemic, and those needs seldom paused for arguments about metaphysical inheritance. On certain feast days, the chapel's candles burned longer, and the incense pooled in thicker swirls under the dome. In the flicker, the painted saints seemed to shift, and the carved capitals caught light along their edges. A listener standing near the wall might hear the faintest chime as a key tapped a belt ring, an absent-minded gesture by a brother moving from stall to stall, a sound too small for chronicle but perfect for memory. Keys and candles. The order of these things had changed. but their presence had not. As the years lengthened, the cross of the Order of Christ found its way onto sails, first along the coasts of Iberia, then farther, edging down shores where maps went pale and blank. The same habits that kept accounts balanced and storehouses supplied proved useful when weeks at sea had to be counted and barrels of water guarded like saints' bones. The world was opening in ways no Templar had been sworn to imagine. Yet if one asked a brother tasked with outfitting a caravel why the ropes were coiled so, why the bread was baked hard and dry, why the casks were chalk-marked with an accountant's care, he might have shrugged and said that such things were always done this way. So new names took hold, old habits endured. The Red Cross shifted shade and shape. The seal's imprint changed its face. The oaths were spoken with a different cadence. But in the cool rooms where decisions were made, in the stables where horses stamped and blew, in the mills where water turned the patient wheel, the work continued. It was not the thunder of crusade, but the slow percussion of stewardship, the rhythm that builds a country and keeps its roads from breaking under winter's weight. And over all of it, beyond Portugal's shores and Paris's stones, the Templar story spread into memory's wider sea, currents of rumor and ritual, books and brotherhoods, sailing toward a long harbor where legend and archive meet. Centuries have a way of turning facts into flotsam. Some sink, some wash up, polished by the tide of retelling. The name of the Knights Templar, dissolved in papal ink in 1312 and burned to ash on a March evening in 1314, refused to sink. It floated across the years, riding currents of rumor, scholarly reconstruction, and romantic invention. By the 15th century, merchants in northern ports could still point to buildings called the Temple, though no brother in white mantle passed their doors. In dusty archives, the parchment trail endured. Bulls with crisp seals slept in ecclesiastical chests. Inquisitors' records, spattered with ink blots and margin notes, waited for curious hands to wake them. The Chinon dossier lay silent for centuries before being rediscovered in the Vatican shelves in 2001, whispering again of absolution offered too late. Historians trace the order's arc in footnotes and charts, weighing evidence against legend, naming what could be known and what must be left as question. Historical record tells us that the Chinon parchment, authenticated in 2007, records that Pope Clement V's envoys absolved the Templar leadership of heresy in 1308, though this did not prevent the order's dissolution. One curious note is that in the 18th century, certain Freemason lodges in France and Scotland wove elaborate origin myths, tracing their lineage to fugitive Templars, complete with invented rituals and titles. Some still question whether such modern fraternal and conspiratorial connections have any basis in medieval continuity or are purely products of Enlightenment-era Romanticism. Beyond the archives, the Templar name found new harbors, in the speculative histories of the Enlightenment, in the historical novels of the 19th century, in 20th century cinema and game boards. Some depictions leaned into the mystery. The treasure fleets from La Rochelle, the fabled Grail, the map hidden in stone walls, while others treated the Templars as prototypes of disciplined brotherhood or as tragic victims of political design. In villages where their commanderies once stood, the memory could be quieter. A carved cross, weathering in a church wall, a lane still called Rue du Temple, an old field boundary traced along a line first surveyed under Templar stewardship. Farmers plowed past the stones without ceremony. Children played in their shadow, inventing their own chivalric orders among the nettles. The order's real legacy was neither the fabulous wealth of rumor nor the apocalyptic curse of legend, but the record of a medieval institution that managed to weld together a life of arms and a life of vows. In their heyday, the Templars had been as much accountants as warriors, as much stewards as knights. That balance, delicate and flawed as it was, proved both their strength and the point of their undoing when the balance of power shifted. Portugal's Order of Christ carried some of that balance forward into new waters, eventually lending its cross to the sails of caravels that edged around Africa and into the Indies. The Hospitallers, in their own way, inherited the mantle of defending Christendom, holding Rhodes and later Malta against Ottoman sieges. In each case, a fragment of the temple's discipline survived, refracted into a different pattern. For the modern imagination, the Templars remain a canvas for questions. How much of their downfall was guilt, and how much was convenience for those in power? What truths lie buried under the layers of accusation, confession, and decree? Why do certain names cling to the mind long after their original bearers are dust? The answers, like the sea, shift with the light. If you were to walk today along the Seine near where the Île aux Juifs once jutted into the current, you would find stone embankments, tourist boats, the hum of traffic on the Pont Neuf. No trace of the gravel bank remains. No monument marks the place of the fire. And yet, at sunset, when the water glows gold and the breeze carries a faint scent of riverweed, it is possible to imagine the silhouettes of two men standing against a low flame, the towers behind them, the crowd hushed. In that moment, the centuries fold like parchment, and the long harbor of memory comes into view, not a place on any map, but a still inlet where history's ships come to rest. The candles gutter low, the wax cools, the keys lie quiet on the table, the bells are silent, the ash settles under the pine. Sleep well, you've walked far enough.